I need your deck. This is a bad one. The worst yet.
Warn you ahead of time, this is going to be a loose and fairly rambling video essay upon the nature of language, symbolism, and misunderstandings thereof, the effect of cultural lenses and all these sorts of things. I don't know that it will come to any particular conclusion, but I want to discuss some of these issues. And I should also warn you ahead of time that I don't really believe in critical analysis. I do not believe that you can really deconstruct an artistic artifact, a film, a poem, a story, in any really successful way. All you can really ever do is say, this is what this means to me. Our experiences and interpretations are way too individual, way too personal, way too influenced by so many other different factors that no one can definitively say that what any cultural artifact means to them is what it means. The only person with any say over that, over what they meant to say, is the artist who creates the piece. So this entire video is really an exercise in futility, but that's essentially what I'm trying to, in a roundabout way, kind of argue, that these interpretations that we place onto other people's work are really meaningless, and all you're really doing is telling your own meta-narrative. I saw this story, and this is what this story means to me. And that's really all we can do.
I thought you might be able to help me with the case.
Bladerunner makes a good framing device for this kind of discussion. For a number of reasons. I love the film very much, the original. I've loved it since I first saw it. It's probably the thing that got me into cyberpunk more than the books, and steeped me in that whole kind of set of lore and ideas. I've always been fascinated by science fiction, particularly by dystopias, and by the idea of enhancing oneself through cybernetics or whatever, and the questions that these bring up. I'm also a fan of Philip K. Dick, upon whose stories these films are based. So yeah, I went to see the new one, and I liked it very much. I disagree violently with Razor Fist, despite sharing a wardrobe on that. I thought it was good, and I thought it dealt with a lot of the same questions. I was enraptured through the whole thing, and it didn't feel too long to me. Not just visually, I thought the ideas that it was playing with were a good extension of the original and built upon the same kind of lore and symbolism of the original. But it makes such a good framing device because so much of that film is deliberately vague and ambiguous. The biggest example of this is probably the whole "is Deckard a replicant" thing, and nobody cares what Ridley Scott thinks about that question. And the sequel still left room for you to not be sure whether he was or not. In many ways it, to unfortunately refer to Lucas, in many ways it rhymed with the original. There were similar themes, but there were also extensions and reinterpretations. In that Deckard was ambiguously possibly a replicant, it was made obvious and clear that K was a replicant. So in many ways, it's twisted that around in that the different symbolism. But the questions lie elsewhere. What Tyrell was doing, and so on. If you decide that Deckard was a replicant, perhaps a prototype of a Nexus 8, in the same way that Rachel appears to have been, with this reproductive capacity that Tyrell was apparently working on, that it's hinted at, you could interpret Rachel and Deckard as being the Adam and Eve of this new race. And the Christian symbolism has always been pretty heavy in Blade Runner.
Every civilization was built off the back of a disposable workforce. But I can only make so many. Happy birthday.
Tyrell and then Wallace here are stand-ins for God, but the replicants are things that are genuinely created beings. They are not natural, they are not evolutionary. Until now, if this reproductive issue can be fixed. And perhaps it's no real wonder that Wallace is blind. The blind watchmaker is an evolutionary analogy for a god. You know, groping around, finding the wheels, putting them together randomly, you know, without direction, without sight, without foresight. But it is still an analogy for God. The God analogy is not as on the nose as it is with Tyrell in the original. The lighting, the candles, the white, you know, even directly saying, you know, meet my maker and all the rest of it. It's much more bomp, bomp, bomp right there in your face. Whereas here it's a little more subtle. But you get the impression that Tyrell somewhat cared, whereas Wallace doesn't necessarily. He seems to be almost transhuman, and perhaps that's the reason for his, you know, artificial enhancements and his little round pebbles going around. But it still constantly and consistently echoes Christian mythology, you know, creation myths, rebellion, and so on. You know, the replicants are the creations of their human masters, their human gods, who are rebelling against their masters. You know, humanity is seen to be in Christian mythology as being in rebellion against God, and another analogy there is Satan. Lucifer, morning star, supposedly rose up against God. Now, this is even more interesting in a Bladerunner context.
I need pre-seas. Fire. Go north. Fire. Oh, come on. Get up.
It seems inescapable to me, but you might disagree, that love is Satan. Lucifer was supposedly the most beloved of God, who then rebelled against God, and is an evil character. Love is really the closest thing we get to an actual villain in Blade Runner 2049, and she does sit at the right hand of Wallace. However, unlike Satan, she stays loyal. And this is an interesting twist. Despite being manufactured to be loyal, Kay is the one who rebels, and he is the hero of the piece. He, in many ways, fulfills the role of Satan. Here we have an ordered society, but both parties are seeking to disrupt it. It's very strange in a way, but it does play off all this Christian mythology and ideas. The idea of a created race made with no free will somehow being able to rebel. I mean, this is something that makes no sense about the Christian story. The angels were made, according to some versions, as instruments of God. They had no free will, whereas men were created with free will. And somehow the angels, or some of them, grew jealous of humanity, being God's most beloved creation, and having this free will, and so rebelled. But rebellion isn't possible without free will. One of many contradictions in the Christian stories. But we can see these themes playing out here. Do you have free will? To what extent is freedom more important than order? Kay is an agent of order who ends up bringing about chaos. Wallace is also a chaotic agent. The closest thing to an actual maintainer of order is the woman in charge of the LAPD, who doesn't get very far with that. So this is an important theme, rebellion, individuality, freedom, and these are all through this Christian lens. We also have a weird issue in Blade Runner in that it's presenting a future that we used to imagine in the past, which was itself based on an earlier cinematic form of the noir. So it's a myth built upon a myth built upon a myth built upon many ways a Christian storytelling paradigm, and that's very much rooted in Western culture. culture is very much like a language in a lot of ways. You know, in a language we learn that collections of letters or sounds have particular meanings, though there can be subtle differences in meaning, and different words that describe the same thing can have different implications and subtleties of meaning. The English has the most adjectives of any language. It's a particularly rich descriptive language, which is perhaps why, despite being such a weird language, English has dominated, you know, poetry, storytelling, all of these kind of arenas. Partly also due to you know, economic and cultural dominance, but I do think some of it is inherent in the language. But different symbols and different things do still have different meanings in different places. I mean, something as simple as the colour red, you know, in Western culture, the colour red is associated with blood, with danger, with stop, you know, whereas in China, red is considered lucky, you know. Brides wear red on their wedding day, money is handed out to kids in red envelopes. It's considered good fortune, it's considered to be lucky. So that's interesting how different cultural artifacts can get different readings from different cultures. I mean, going back to Bladerunner again, you know, it's themes of individuality, of rebellion, of free will versus destiny, of order versus chaos, and freedom that comes with chaos. These read a certain way in a Western paradigm that they may not, again, in a Chinese paradigm, which tends to be more collectivist and more denoted to order. So from a Chinese perspective, you could see Kay and the others as villains. The only real upholder of order is, again, the woman in the LAPD. It would be interesting to see how Chinese audiences have reacted to this and similar stories, because these stories dominate Western culture. I remember looking back at Mad Max Fury Road, and from a certain perspective, you can see that Immortan Joe is really the hero of the piece. He has forged together a civilization of multiple communities that are trading. You know, he's sensibly controlling the water supply, he's enforcing order, he's finding a use for the crippled mutant offspring that are there, making them useful as war boys and advisors and so forth. He's even trying to breed true to eliminate these mutations, to provide a future for humanity, and then along come Furiosa and Max and fuck the whole thing up and ruin this one bright point of hope in the wilderness, albeit a nasty and despotic place. Maybe that's needed in a post-apocalyptic hellscape, who knows. But, you know, from a certain point of view, you can see him as the hero and Max and Furiosa as the villain, just as from a certain point of view you can see Kay and even Wallace as villains, as Blade Runner 2049 being two villains fighting over who gets to fuck up the world, you know? So all of these symbols, all of these meanings are interpreted through these lenses. We have a common cultural lens to an extent that we all have, but we also have regional lenses, the personal experience lens, and subcultural lenses. And then things like critical theory come along, and they have very different and distorted lenses.
And at that very moment, the words
I seem to be having this tremendous difficulty with my lifestyle.
drifted across the table. Unfortunately, in the Vlehurg tongue, this was the most dreadful insult imaginable, and there was nothing for it but to fight terrible war.
Incongruous clip, I know, but it makes the point, and it's one of my favourite scenes from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So the point there is that what seems completely innocent in one paradigm, in one language, whether it's a spoken language, written language, or the language of symbols, what seems perfectly innocent in one may seem terrible in another. And some people seem to have put on cultural lenses through which they interpret, you know, cultural artifacts that seem determined to interpret things in the absolute worst way possible. One of those might be the feminist lens, and that's one that's certainly been turned on Blade Runner. Another might be the Marxist lens. I don't want to work people up into a frenzy about cultural Marxism, but people have this weird idea that it is some conspiracy to control culture in order to promote Marxism, whereas all it really is another one of these lenses you put on to examine works in how they support or enforce or create, standard hierarchies of control. So you might look at say, Tony Stark, for example, and say, oh well, here's a fine example of something that's offensive to a Marxist point of view. Here is this individual who has made huge amounts of money off the backs of other workers and through the war machine, even though he goes back on that part. Abusing his wealth, being presented as this success story that people should aspire to, but this is not available to the common worker, or whatever. This is just a 2-minute off the top of my head kind of analysis through that way. But you can see through that, and through that feminist lens, how there is this determination to take everything negatively. So when something is presented in a way that offends these sensibilities, there doesn't seem to be any flexibility, at least a lot of the time, to understand that the representation is perhaps negative. When a villain does something horrible to a woman, it's not necessarily reinforcing patriarchy or whatever. It establishes them as a villain, that what they've done is an outrage to the common sensibilities of the audience. If you want to signal that someone is an evil bastard, there are few better ways, though it's perhaps lazy, of doing that than to have them abuse a woman, a child, an animal. I know people will leap on that and say I'm making some kind of equivalency between them, but the equivalency is that all of these things are seen as a moral outrage in the common cultural paradigm. I'm not saying anything about that, I'm trying to explain how that works. But there is symbolism connected to maleness and femaleness, to men and women as well. And that's played with in Blade Runner. The creator is a man, this blind guy with these floating pebbles that scan things, and he's trying to create a vessel to reproduce for him. And love is sterile and artificial and created, and Kay is created. And yet the most human and sympathetic character in the whole thing may well be the holographic companion, and she's even less real than the replicants. And for me at least, it was around her where the big question of what is she, the big question of identity and freedom and so on came from. Was she just doing what she did in order to ingratiate herself with Kay? What you want to see, what you want to hear, what you want to do, this companion will do it all. Or was she genuinely grown? And so we're back to the problem with criticising art, the problem with critical analysis, the problem with analysis of cultural artifacts in any way.
I love you.
You cannot tell me what this means to me. You can only tell me what this means to you. What I like and why I like it is not something you can have any insight into unless I tell you, and unless I'm being honest. So when you come at a film or a book or a comic or anything else with your self-imposed lenses that perhaps you've learned in university in gender studies or whatever else, that's just a point of view that you have imposed upon yourself. It's not a view that's shared by anyone else, and just because you see these meanings in these symbols doesn't mean that's what the artist intended, and it doesn't mean it's what anyone else sees in it. Here I've talked about things that I see and I got from this particular film, and I could do that for any cultural artifact, and it might be interesting to people to see and understand my point of view. But I'm absolutely not saying that anyone else has to see the same things that I do, that they have to like the film, that they have to dislike the film, that films shouldn't be made in this way, or whatever else. I write, I make games, in the process of doing so, I don't honestly usually put that much thought into the symbols and so on that I put into my work. It's instinctual. I just do what I feel works, and I think a lot of artists and creative people work in the same way. They do what they like, they do what resonates with them. They have an instinct within certain bands of creativity, and sometimes that resonates with a wider audience because it somehow taps into the greater cultural language and symbolism that exists. Critics like Sarkeesian, and I don't want to just pick on her, it's just she's one that I'm most familiar with. They think their interpretation is universal when it isn't. They think everyone sees, consciously or unconsciously, what they see when they look at a piece of work. And they want to change those pieces of work in order to try and change people's attitudes. And I think that's asked backwards. I think artistic works emerge from the cultural zeitgeist in a lot of ways, or from particularly talented individuals. I don't think it's anything you can really particularly harness. The only way to do that is through propaganda, and that requires the kind of monoculture that emerges either in times of great cultural and societal distress, such as all-out war, or within tightly controlled societies like North Korea, which are completely cut off, or almost completely cut off, from outside influences. That's the only way you get to really control culture. Otherwise, all you can do is contribute. And I don't think these kinds of critical analysis and so on particularly contribute. I think maybe we can share our interpretations, and there's nothing wrong with that, with what we see in things, and how we think a certain thing particularly worked well or whatever. But this judgmental preaching way of trying to tell people this is what this means, this is what this does, by liking this you are endorsing this, that, not so much. So this is a rambling half-hour video essay about critical analysis, involving critical analysis, and telling you that critical analysis, in the end, is horseshit. So you may as well not have watched it. Zang.
All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain.
Just